Hi, we begin with 1 Samuel 27 day as David decides that going over to the Philistines is his best solution for avoiding Saul. If you haven't watched the introductory video to this section, 1 Samuel 27 to 31, I really encourage you to do so you can see some of the issues that we'll face, including when the text was written and how the temporal sequence plays out here in relation to the order in which the texts are actually written. I'm going to assume you've watched that, though, although I'll touch on a couple of the pieces as we go, including that on the right side of the screen we see this chiasm that covers the second half of 1 Samuel, and today we're in this section around David among the Philistines, paralleling the fact that he was there earlier. And that's really important now that we're in this section, because we saw last time that when David went to King Achish, when the Philistines were suspicious that David was an Israelite and would be not on their side, he played the madman and Achish dismissed him. Is Achish not going to remember that David seemed to be insane last time he was there? He doesn't apparently remember that at all. And although it's not clear exactly how much time has passed, it's not that long in the scheme of things. David's whole reign and the parenthood of his children who become adults within the story, many of them, is yet to come. So the fact that Achish doesn't remember is one of the many elements here that suggests Achish plays the fool, parallel to Nabal, as we saw in chapter 25. And that makes sense in a way out of how these chapters are sequenced. Although here the frame of this sandwich here has Achish the fool on the outside, and here Nabal the fool is on the inside. That's because last time David was with Saul, and so perhaps Achish is a stand-in for Saul here, and in many ways we'll see that he sort of is, even though David is with Achish trying to escape from Saul. But we'll certainly see how these two pieces of David and Achish are split up by the section with Saul and the woman of Endor in the middle there. So we'll see how that plays out as we go. There aren't a lot of key words in this chapter, but there are two, and they're key for what's going on, because in the scene we're going to look at today, we're actually going to look at this part of it. Escape is the theme. At least in the heart of David. This is all said in his heart as far as we know, and the narrator can get inside David's heart to report that. But in the rest of the chapter, the image is settled. And although the term settled is not translated, the Hebrew word is not translated this way by most texts. Here we'll see it stayed at, like we see in verse 3 here. Settled is the key point, that David is not expecting to just be here temporarily, but he's settling in. And as we'll see, he'll bring his wives, and all his men bring their whole household. So this is not meant to be a short-term solution. As far as we can tell, they're moving in. And it's a very strange scene, but we'll look at that as we go. So right from the beginning, we hear David said in his heart. Let's look at the verse and hear what he says, and then we'll look at the commentators. He says, I shall now perish one day by the hand of Saul. There is nothing better for me than to escape to the land of the Philistines. Then Saul will despair of seeking me any longer within the borders of Israel, and I shall escape out of his hand. And for naive readers, which is to say readers who either aren't already suspicious of what David's saying or thinking, or who don't know what's following in these chapters, that seems reasonable enough. But let's hear what commentators have to say about it. First of all, my note below is highlighting that the pairing of Vayomer for said and in the heart, as far as I'm aware, is only here in the Deuteronomistic history. So the narrator of the larger Deuteronomistic history from Deuteronomy to 2 Kings doesn't otherwise claim the ability to get inside people's hearts that way. And yet even their scholars are suspicious. As Bodner notes below, is it possible that even in its inner thoughts David is politically astute? It seems unlikely that David should believe these things. More plausibly, David would want his men to know that this is what he was thinking. Furthermore, he goes on with the analogy of Esau saying in his heart, about planning to kill Jacob, as the foundation for inner thoughts being revealed to those around him. And Bodner continues, when David speaks to his heart, one cannot help thinking that such thoughts are exactly what he wants his men to hear. Diana Edelman continues here, noting instead of listening to his heart, David is telling his heart what his predecided course of action is to be, rationalizing it according to human perceptions and logic. She continues, David has lost sight of his own special relationship with Yahweh as the king-elect and has lost faith in Yahweh's continued protection and support. Which is to say, after being chased by Saul and having caught Saul twice and refused to harm the Lord's anointed, Saul has twice said that he's not going to follow David anymore. and that Yahweh clearly has protected him to the extent that David is alive, and we want to attribute causation to Yahweh for that. But now he's not even evoking Yahweh, as he will later in other things, as we'll see, especially in chapter 30. So why leads Bodner to suspect that this isn't really what he's likely to be thinking? Well, we'll see as we go. But one of the things we can certainly name now is that settling into Philistine territory will enable David, and his first request, as we'll see today, is for a city to have a base from which he can gather spoils that he can distribute to his network and build up a network of loyalty and support, a patronage network really, so that when the time finally comes for him to take the throne, he'll be ready to go. So it's not as naive, perhaps, as the inner thoughts of David the narrator presents here are actually what he's thinking. But David's heart is hard to access even when the narrator purports to. So let's look more specifically at what he says. I shall now perish here. The word esephah here in the Niphal is only here in the Masoretic text. The Brown Driver Briggs lexicon suggests to be swept away or destroyed, which is a very exile-sounding term, although, as I note, the word is only used here. But let's look at a couple of other places it's used in 1 Samuel, not in the Niphal form, but in a slightly different form, to highlight what's being echoed here. As we see in 12:25, this is Samuel talking, but if you still do wickedly, you shall be swept away, both you and your king. So to the extent that these chapters, and as I was noting last time with the chart showing how the details of 1 Samuel 28 echo various elements from all of 1 Samuel as we go, suggesting I could have done the same thing for these other chapters as well, this is certainly one of those hints, whether it's about the exile or about the end of monarchy, which are ultimately the same thing. This is certainly suggesting that echo here as well. So, and yet what he's suggesting is, I shall now perish one day by the hand of Saul, apparently not believing that Saul has relented. And as we'll find out, that's in fact accurate, as we'll see. There is nothing better, weirdly it's reversed in the Hebrew, literally nothing good for me, other than to escape to the land of the Philistines. And that's where we see the key word escape 3 times there, as it was a key word in chapter 19 earlier. Then Saul will despair of seeking me, a word here, only here in the Deuteronomic history, but a couple of other times for being hopeless or despairing. And will despair of seeking me any longer within the borders of Israel. And notice this unusual phrase, borders here, gavul, for boundary, and it's been used a number of times earlier. But what would such borders mean at this time? We don't have any formal sense from the atlas that there are such borders. The colored codes are just there for convenience to separate this supposedly Israelite territory that Saul is in control of from the Philistine territory along the Mediterranean coast there. But there aren't formal boundaries at this point. This is wide open country where there's a few small towns and then just farming and ranching and migratory people out in the dry areas. So what the borders might be isn't clear, but certainly he's suggesting to get outside of the area that Saul could control. And it's interesting that he notes borders of Israel. What about Judah? We'll hear Judah mentioned about Gath in just a couple of minutes. So let's consider that he's separating Israel from Judah here. And I shall escape out of his hand. Note, as I was suggesting, or didn't suggest, but I had in my note at the beginning, you can see down here the little chiasm in the verse framed around the hand of Saul and the question of the boundaries there. So having done that, now David, it says, set out and went over. Sumura, my note below, says the text in 27:2 shows no hint of Achish's previous meeting with David. And that's the element I was trying to get at earlier. So he set out, literally stood up as an expression of getting moving, and went over here, or literally Hebrewed, in that sense of ver, from which you get the word Hebrew, to go over or to cross over. So it's ironic that the word Hebrew is used here when he's crossing over away from being part of Israel, or pejoratively referred to by the Philistines earlier as Hebrews, over to the side where the Philistines think of the Israelites as Hebrews, as crossers over. He and the 600 men who we saw earlier, who were with him. So this is his core band of the disaffected that he'd gathered and had been with him all along. And the description of where he's going is very interesting. Notice it doesn't just say he's going to the place, specifically to the person, King Achish, son of Maach of Gath. And as the note below has from Borgen, what strange business this is to think Achish can be duped again. Cynthia Edenberg notes that the name Achish is borrowed from this, likely borrowed from the 7th century BCE inscriptions and applied to the Philistine king here because of a couple issues. One is the Philistines otherwise aren't reported to have kings. We noted this back in chapter 1. They have 5 so-called lords who serve as a council. And so this reference to King Achish is perhaps a fictional element of the story here. But referred to as son of Maach, and as the note below from Samora notes, the more usual version for a king would be this, Ben Maach, or Ben Ami, Ben meaning the Hebrew word for son of. So it would be more likely that he would be described that way. And then of Gath. And Gath that we've seen many times, not least of which is the home of Goliath. And you'd think that would be obvious that David is coming back to the very place that the Philistines first sent out as their champion to taunt and, they thought, to defeat the Israelites. And young David came up and defeated Goliath. And you'd think the people of Gath might remember that. The map shows Gath over here, although from our archaeological basis it's not exactly clear. Here's an archaeological view of the archaeologist himself at a place that's suggested to be Gath, but as the article from which the picture is from, there's no inscription that suggests explicitly that it's Gath, so we just don't know for sure. But it's certainly understood as one of the 5 towns of the Philistines, along with these others along the coast here. And so, although it says that he went over, now he's staying with them with no conversation. No sense that Achish or the other Philistines, when he entered the city, are going, wait a minute, who are you? First of all, as an anonymous stranger, why are you walking into our town? Certainly, if you've watched any of my Genesis series, we know how suspicious ancient city people were of strangers. The Lot story in Genesis 19 being a key example, although there are many others. The whole point of having a city with a wall was to keep strangers out. So David seems to just wander in and directly with the king. He seems to have access directly to the king, although it's not clear that Achish has authority beyond Gath, according to this version of the story. So he wouldn't necessarily be a leader of a great area. Gath is still a relatively small place. But still, the idea that he could just walk right in with his 600 men and not be seen as a suspect is something questionable in the story. But not only the 600 men we hear. This is over-translated as troops. It's literally his men, and that'll be important later. Every man with his household, which is to say his whole family. Would it also include their household animals, if they have those as a means of survival and economics, etc.? And David with his 2 women, wives, Ahinoam of Jezreel and Abigail of Carmel, Nabal's widow, as described here. As we noted earlier, Ahinoam was the name of Saul's wife, and scholars are divided on whether or not the text is suggesting that David has actually acquired Saul's wife along with Nabal's wife. And the only difference seems to be scholars who either are pious enough to think that David wouldn't do such a thing, or that it's so blatant that it would have been mentioned by Saul or otherwise, although if you had your wife stolen, you might not want to mention it out loud, would you? So it's either a coincidence that there are 2 women named Ahinoam, and one of them happens to be the wife of Saul, who's never mentioned again, or David has taken the wives of 2 of his rivals. And notice they're always mentioned together. We'll see them again in 35 and in 2 Samuel 2:2. And Abigail is always named as Nabal's woman, not formerly Nabal's woman, but Nabal's woman, highlighting that David took her, even though Nabal was dead at the time, so it wasn't that suspicious, but really highlighting how things show up for David, where he doesn't take any responsibility for it, and the text doesn't attribute any responsibility for it. As it will not for the death of Saul at the end of our scene, having situated David way far from where the battle that Saul dies at will take place. So let's continue with our immediate scene through verse 6 here. As we note here from Bodner, not clear why Saul stops pursuing him. Given the possibility of a David-Philistine alliance, this is, in Bodner's words, the worst time to give up the pursuit. But we're told is when Saul was told that David had fled to Gath, still the informer network. And now at this point in the story, I want to highlight something about that. We've seen this informer network all along the chase, that Saul was told where David is and David's told where Saul is, but it's never been clear who these people are, and it's still not clear. But I'd like to suggest, given the ambiguity of where David is at Saul's death, as some scholars have suggested, and we'll look at more later, perhaps there's a so-called fifth column, a group of people within Saul's entourage, especially Benjaminites, who may have been working for David all this time, at least in part, and we'll see more of that in the end. So that could well be the case here. They're telling that to protect David from Saul, and he no longer seeks him here. Or as a different translation suggests down below, no longer sought him again. And for fleeing here, we'll note that we've seen the fleeing on all these different times. So now, for the first time, David actually speaks to Achish, and Achish isn't recorded speaking back. And we have to look very carefully at his language here, because it indicates how he speaks to Achish, but it also indicates that it's probably not exactly what it sounds like. So as my note below, as Bodner suggests, 27:5 is indicative of the way he will communicate with Achish from now on, flattering, with leading questions, and fraught with equivocation. Let's hear it in detail. So, if I have found favor in your sight, or literally if please, on what basis would he have found favor at this point? Last time Achish saw him, he was playing the madman, and now he's come in with 600 men and all the women and presumably children and animals, this incredible entourage that is going to cost Achish, isn't it? At least at first glance, if they're going to stay here in Gath, they're going to have to be fed and taken care of, etc., and presumably protected. For all we know, 600 men and their families, which could be at least a couple thousand people, might be as much as the entire population of the town. We don't know what basis there might be for David to believe that Achish has already found favor in his sight. But it's a standard phrase of diplomatic entreaty as well. So he offers that without a chance to hear whether it's true or not. Let a place be given me in one of the country towns. Notice the backhanded way of saying this. He doesn't ask for it directly. Can I have a place? Give me a place. Let a place be given to me in passive voice. Notice it doesn't say that Achish should do it, and it doesn't say that David is asking for it. It's just passive and leaving Achish off the hook, apparently. One of the country towns here, literally, Are Hasadeh, city of the fields. What can that mean exactly? Well, perhaps like a farming town or a ranching town, or a town just way out in the country, away from where Achish is, presumably from David's perspective, where he can see people coming and they can't see exactly what he's doing. So that I may live there, or literally settle there. It's one of the places the key word is covered over. And then he asks rhetorically, for why should your servant live in the royal city with you? And it seems to be suggesting that I'm just a lowly person here on the run, and I don't have nearly the status for the royal city. But plainly what's going on is, I don't want to be in your sight. Because as we'll see in the next video, David will tell Achish he's doing one thing, and the narrator will tell us that David is doing something very different. So we'll know from the next scene that David is perfectly willing to lie to Achish's face, and Achish seems unable to detect it, even though he knows that David is able to play the madman. Either David is a good actor, or he was previously insane, and Achish should be suspect of him. But he's not. He doesn't ask any questions or express any hesitation at all. All we hear is the narrator say, so that day Achish gave him Ziklag. It's mentioned earlier in List, but we know nothing about it, although the map seems to show it right here. In fact, archaeologically, it's unclear exactly where it is. It could be in that spot, but it could be in a number of areas there. Because it's later in chapter 30 connected to the Wadi Besor, the places that scholars tend to be looking are in this area, but the reality is that we don't know. But notice how the narrator finishes this unit. Therefore, Ziklag has belonged to the kings of Judah to this day. Earlier, I was noting the fact that the issue was Israel, and now it's noting the kings of Judah, because this area in the purple would later be Judah. Jerusalem's up here, and the southern area would be Judah. But as the note below from Samora, quoting Halpern, suggests, no such statement could be made after the early 9th century, and probably not after Shishak, who was the Egyptian pharaoh's campaign in 925, which is to say, by that time, Ziklag and this whole area was under the control of the Egyptians. Although perhaps if this story is from hundreds of years later, it might have then become a part of Judah to this day, which is to say the day of exile. It's not clear from this day, that day, and this day, when the narrator's this day is. Is it from the time of exile or something else? It's not clear. But all we know is that it'll stop being Philistine territory and eventually become part of Judah. And David is just going to sit there for a while, and we'll see next time what he does to build up some booty that he can use later to reward those who side with him against Saul, especially when Saul dies at the end of our book. We'll continue with that next time. See you then. Bye-bye.